Don't touch what isn't yours. The woman's voice cut through the music like a blade, sharp enough to still the air beneath the string lights as every conversation around the garden froze mid-laugh, mid-sip, mid-breath, and Ava Brooks felt the words land before she even realized all eyes had turned toward her. The soft glow of amber bulbs reflecting off polished glass tables and silver trays while the distant hum of a violinist stretched thin against the sudden silence, her fingers still gently wrapped around the small wrist of the child beside her who had been trembling just seconds ago, the kind of trembling that didn't belong at a party like this, not under chandeliers hung from oak branches, not among people dressed in pressed linen and tailored silk. But Ava hadn't thought about that when she knelt down moments earlier, hadn't thought about the guests or the whispers or the weight of being watched. She had only seen the boy's eyes, wide and glassy, darting between shadows like he was trying to outrun something no one else could see, and instinct, quiet and practiced, had guided her hand to his, grounding him the way she had learned long ago in places far less forgiving than this manicured lawn. But now that same hand was the reason the woman stood in front of her, heels planted firm against the stone path, posture rigid with a kind of entitlement that didn't need to be spoken twice. Victoria Caldwell didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone carried the kind of authority that made people step back without realizing they had moved. And yet there was something colder beneath it tonight, something brittle, like glass under pressure, as she looked at Ava not as a person but as an interruption, a disruption in the perfect symmetry of her event. And for a moment the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves overhead and the distant clink of ice in untouched glasses. Ava slowly released the boy's wrist, but didn't step away, her posture steady, her breathing even, though she could feel the shift around her, the subtle lean of guests angling closer, the quiet judgment forming in the space between them, and somewhere behind Victoria, a server hesitated mid-step, unsure whether to continue or disappear, because this wasn't just a correction, it was a moment, the kind that defined who belonged and who didn't, and Ava knew exactly where she stood in their eyes, the hired help, the background, the one who moved quietly through rooms without leaving a trace, except now she had stepped into the frame, and the cost of that was unfolding in real time under the soft golden light. The boy's fingers still curled slightly as if searching for the comfort she had just taken away, and Ava's gaze flickered to him for just a second, enough to notice the way his shoulders tightened again, the way the calm she had offered was already slipping. But when she looked back at Victoria, her expression hadn't changed, still composed, still unreadable, as if the silence itself was something she controlled, stretched and held in place like everything else around her. And in that suspended moment, with the night air warm against her skin and the weight of every stare pressing in, Ava didn't lower her eyes, didn't retreat. She simply stood there, quiet, present, as if the truth of who she was didn't need to be announced, only revealed. Ava Brooks had learned a long time ago how to stand still without disappearing, how to exist in a room without asking for space, and yet not surrender the quiet dignity that no one ever offered her freely. And as the silence stretched across the garden like a held breath, her mind did not rush to defend herself. It did not scramble for explanations or apologies. Instead, it moved somewhere softer, somewhere older, back to narrow hallways that smelled faintly of detergent and warm air, to nights measured not in hours but in the rhythm of other people's needs, where she had watched her mother lace up worn shoes before sunrise and return long after dark, carrying exhaustion like a second skin but never letting it touch the way she spoke to her, always gentle, always steady, as if kindness was not something you gave when you had extra, but something you protected even when you had nothing left. And Ava had carried that lesson into every room she had ever entered, every job she had ever taken, from quiet suburban homes to towering estates where her name was rarely spoken and her presence was noticed only when something went wrong. She had learned the patterns, the unspoken rules, when to move, when to pause, when to make herself smaller so others could feel larger, but she had never confused that with being less, never let the world convince her that her silence meant she had no voice, because her voice lived in the way she noticed things others ignored, in the way she caught the shift in a child's breathing before it turned into panic, in the way she could read discomfort in a glance or fear in a tightened grip. And that was why she had stepped forward tonight without hesitation, why she had knelt beside the boy even as the music played and the laughter rose around them. Because to her, he was not an interruption to the evening. He was a person asking for help in the only way he knew how, and that mattered more than any rule she might have broken, more than any line she might have crossed. And now, as she stood beneath the glow of lights that were never meant for her, she could feel the weight of judgment pressing in from every direction, the quiet assumptions forming like shadows at the edges of the crowd. But she did not shrink from it, did not let it pull her inward. Instead, she grounded herself the same way she had grounded the child, through stillness, through breath, through the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, even if no one else understood it yet. And somewhere behind her, the faint sound of the boy shifting on his feet reached her ears, subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that the moment had not passed for him, that whatever storm had been rising inside him was still there, waiting. And Ava knew that in rooms like this, filled with polished surfaces and perfect appearances, storms like that were often the first thing people tried to hide, the first thing they dismissed or silenced. But she also knew what happened when they were ignored, how quickly they could grow, how deeply they could root themselves. And that knowledge sat quietly within her now, steady and unshaken, even as the woman in front of her held the power to remove her from this place with a single word, because Ava had never measured her worth by who allowed her to stay, only by what she chose to stand for when it mattered most. Victoria Caldwell had never been ignored in her own home, not in a room she curated down to the angle of every chair and the tone of every light. And yet the woman standing in front of her refused to fold into the moment the way everyone else always did, refused to shrink under the quiet pressure that usually bent people without effort. And that defiance, subtle as it was, unsettled her more than any raised voice ever could. Because Victoria understood control, she understood how to shape a room, how to guide attention with a glance, how to make discomfort disappear before it could take form. But this was different. This was a disruption she could not immediately correct, and it flickered beneath her composed exterior like a hairline crack, her gaze sharpening as she studied Ava not as an employee, but as a variable she had not accounted for, someone who did not follow the expected script. And behind that gaze was a lifetime of reinforcement, of being told without words that she belonged at the center, that spaces like this existed because of people like her, that order was something she maintained and others adapted to, and she had built her world accordingly, layering precision over perception until even her emotions felt structured, measured, controlled. But control required compliance, required people to respond in predictable ways, and Ava's stillness disrupted that rhythm, creating a pause that stretched longer than Victoria was comfortable with, long enough for the murmurs around them to begin forming again, soft and uncertain, like a ripple she had not approved, and she could feel it, the subtle shift in attention, the way eyes moved not just toward her but between them, as if the balance of the moment had not yet been decided. And that was something she could not allow, not here, not in front of donors, partners, people whose opinions translated into influence and power. Because tonight was not just a gathering, it was a statement, a carefully orchestrated display of stability after months of quiet scrutiny, after questions she had deflected with polished answers and controlled smiles, after whispers about how quickly she had assumed control of everything left behind. And she had answered those whispers by creating something flawless, something undeniable, a night where everything aligned exactly as it should. Except now there was this moment, this interruption that refused to resolve itself. And Victoria's fingers tightened slightly at her side, not enough to draw attention, but enough to ground her, to remind herself that she still held the authority here, that nothing had actually changed, that one employee did not alter the structure she had built. And yet as she looked at Ava again, truly looked, she noticed details she had dismissed before, the steadiness in her posture, the absence of panic in her expression, the way she did not glance around for approval or support. And something about that composure felt out of place, not in the sense of belonging to a different class or background, but in the sense of carrying a certainty that did not come from this environment at all. And for the briefest moment, something unfamiliar brushed against Victoria's thoughts, not doubt exactly, but curiosity, quickly buried beneath the need to reassert order, because whatever this was, Whatever tension had formed in the space between them, it could not remain unresolved. Not under these lights. Not in a place where every second of silence felt louder than any confrontation. And so she drew in a slow breath, the kind that signaled a decision rather than hesitation, preparing to move the moment forward, to close it, to restore the balance she knew how to maintain, even if the path to doing so felt less certain than it should have. Ava felt the shift before it happened, not through movement but through intention. The way the air seemed to tighten just slightly as Victoria Caldwell straightened her posture and lifted her chin a fraction higher. A signal so subtle most people would miss it. But Ava had spent years reading rooms like this, understanding the language that lived beneath words, and she knew that whatever came next would not be quiet. Yet even then her focus did not move to the woman in front of her. It returned to the boy, because his breathing had changed again. Uneven now, shallow, his small fingers twitching at his side, as if searching for something to hold on to. And the lights above, warm and golden to everyone else, were beginning to reflect too brightly in his eyes, turning the soft glow into something harsher, sharper, and Ava recognized that look. The way overstimulation crept in quietly before it took over. Completely. The way a child could go from still to overwhelmed in a matter of seconds if no one intervened. And she also knew what would happen if he was forced to stand there any longer, surrounded by noise and expectation and unspoken rules he could not process. So without asking, without announcing, she took a slow step sideways, positioning herself just slightly between him and the crowd, not blocking, not confronting, just creating a small pocket of space where the pressure eased by a fraction, her voice low when she spoke, calm enough that it did not carry beyond them, steady enough that it anchored something inside him. She did not give instructions, she did not draw attention. She simply mirrored his breathing for a moment. Slow inhale, gentle exhale, the rhythm subtle but deliberate, the kind of quiet guidance that did not demand compliance but invited it. And for a second nothing changed. The tension still hung in the air, the crowd still watched, Victoria still stood, waiting for her authority to be acknowledged. But then the boy's shoulders dropped just slightly, his fingers loosening, his gaze shifting away from the lights and toward Ava instead, and that was enough. Enough to tell her she was reaching him, enough to keep going. Even as she knew every second she remained in that position was a direct defiance of the order that had been placed on her moments ago, and somewhere to her left, a guest shifted uncomfortably, the faint scrape of a shoe against stone breaking the silence, just enough to remind everyone that this was still unfolding, that this moment had not been resolved, and Ava could feel it now, the weight of expectation pressing harder, the unspoken demand for her to step back, to apologize, to restore the invisible boundary she had crossed. But she did not move, because stepping back now would mean leaving the boy alone in a moment he could not navigate, and that was not something she was willing to do. Not for the sake of appearances, not for the comfort of a room that had never been built with him in mind. And as she continued to stand there, quiet but unwavering, something shifted again, not in the boy this time, but in the space around them. A subtle fracture in the certainty that had filled the garden only minutes before, as if the definition of who belonged and who did not was no longer as clear as it had seemed. And for the first time that night, the balance of power did not rest entirely where it was expected to. It hovered, uncertain, suspended between a woman who controlled the room and another who refused to abandon what was right, even when the cost of that choice was already beginning to unfold. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, thin and uneven, as Victoria Caldwell finally stepped forward, her heels pressing sharply against the stone with a precision that carried more weight than any raised voice. And when she spoke, her tone was controlled but edged with something colder now, something that no longer tried to disguise itself as polite correction but settled into authority that expected immediate compliance. She did not look at the boy, she did not acknowledge the shift in his breathing or the small space Ava had created. Her focus remained fixed, unwavering, as if the rest of the scene had already been decided in her mind, and the words she chose were measured, deliberate, each one placed with the intention of restoring order, of reminding everyone present where the boundaries lay and who had the right to define them. And around them the guests leaned subtly, not closer in support, but closer in anticipation, drawn by the quiet escalation that now replaced the earlier stillness. Because moments like this, moments where power reasserted itself, were familiar, expected, almost comforting in their predictability, and yet what unfolded did not settle as neatly as it should have. Because Ava did not respond the way the room anticipated, she did not rush to apologize, did not step back with lowered eyes or softened posture. She simply remained where she was, her presence calm but unyielding, her attention still divided between the woman in front of her and the child beside her whose fingers had begun to curl again, the fragile calm slipping as quickly as it had formed, and that refusal, quiet as it was, created a tension that no one seemed prepared to resolve. Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the faintest shift at the corner of her mouth, a signal that the moment had crossed from inconvenience into something personal, something that challenged not just her authority, but the certainty she had built around it. And for a brief second the garden felt smaller, the carefully arranged space closing in under the weight of expectation, and then the decision came, not announced but executed, Victoria's hand lifting in a controlled motion that carried the finality of someone used to ending conversations without debate, a gesture meant to close the moment, to reset the balance, to remind everyone watching that control had never truly left her. And when it happened, the sound that followed was not loud, but it carried, sharp enough to ripple through the silence and settle into the space between them. And the reaction was immediate, not from Ava, who did not step back or raise her voice, but from the room itself, a collective shift. A quiet intake of breath, the kind that came when something crossed from unspoken tension into undeniable reality. And still Ava did not respond in the way they expected, her hand lifting slowly, not in defense, not in retaliation, but simply to steady the boy beside her whose composure had broken completely now, his breathing uneven, his small frame trembling under the weight of a moment he could not understand. And Ava's focus returned to him without hesitation, as if nothing else in the room held more importance than bringing him back from the edge he had been pushed toward. And that choice, that quiet refusal to engage in anything but care, landed heavier than any confrontation could have. Because it did not escalate the situation, it exposed it, stripped it of performance, and left only truth behind. And in that truth, something shifted again, deeper this time, as the room that had once stood firmly behind one kind of power began, however subtly, to question it, even if no one spoke a word. The sound faded, but the weight of it did not. It lingered in the air like something unfinished, something that refused to settle back into the polished rhythm the evening had promised. And for a moment no one moved, not the guests, not the servers, not even Victoria Caldwell, whose hand lowered slowly, as if the gesture had already done what it was meant to do. And yet the result was not what she expected. Because the room did not return to her, it did not immediately realign around her control. Instead it held, suspended in a quiet that felt different now, heavier, more aware, and in the center of that stillness Ava Brooks knelt slightly, her attention no longer divided, no longer pulled between expectation and presence. It rested entirely on the child whose world had narrowed to sound and light and sensation, his breathing uneven, his small hands clenched as if holding on to something invisible. And Ava's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, soft enough that it belonged only to him, steady enough that it cut through everything else. She did not rush him, did not try to silence the moment. She allowed it, sat with it, guiding him back one breath at a time. Slow inhale, gentle exhale, her own breathing matching his until the rhythm began to return, until the tension in his shoulders eased just enough to signal that he was finding his way back. And around them the world seemed to dim, not physically but in focus, the details that had once defined the scene. The lights, the music, the carefully arranged tables, all faded into the background as something quieter took their place, something more real. And a few feet away a glass shifted on a tray, the faint clink startling in its normalcy, a reminder that life continued even in moments like this. But no one stepped forward, no one interrupted, because something had changed in the way they were watching. Now, the curiosity replaced with something closer to recognition, not of Ava's role or her position, but of the choice she was making, the refusal to be pulled into the performance of conflict, the decision to remain anchored in something deeper than the moment itself. And Victoria stood there, still at the center of her own event, yet somehow outside of it now. Her presence no longer the sole point of gravity. Her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. And for the first time that evening, there was a pause in her certainty, a flicker of something she did not immediately name. Because control had always come easily to her, had always followed the patterns she understood. But this quiet defiance wrapped in compassion, this unwillingness to engage on her terms, did not fit within those patterns, and it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately correct. And the longer the silence stretched, the more it revealed not just Ava's strength, but the fragility of the structure that had been assumed unshakable. And as the boy's breathing steadied further, his fingers loosening, his gaze softening as it fixed on Ava with a trust that had nothing to do with status or ownership, something else settled into the space between them all, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, a shift that could not be undone by authority alone. And in that quiet, under the warm glow of lights that now felt less certain in their purpose, the balance of the night began to change in ways no one had planned and no one could ignore. The shift did not announce itself with noise or movement. It arrived quietly, carried on the measured footsteps of a man who had not been part of the scene until now, his presence cutting through the lingering tension not by force, but by contrast, as if he belonged to a different rhythm entirely. And the moment he stepped onto the stone path, the subtle murmur of recognition began to ripple through the guests, heads turning, conversations halting again, but for a different reason this time. Because Daniel Reeves was not someone who appeared without purpose, not someone who attended events casually, and certainly not someone who ignored what unfolded in front of him. His suit simple but precise, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested authority without needing to display it. And as he approached, his gaze moved first to the boy, then to Ava, and only then to Victoria, as if he were assessing the truth of the moment rather than the surface of it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough weight to settle into the air without demanding attention. Yet everyone heard it. Is there a reason my property manager was not informed about tonight's incident? And the question did not land as a challenge. It landed as fact, as if something had already been established long before this moment. And for a second no one responded, the words taking time to register, to connect, to rearrange the understanding of the room. Because Daniel Reeves was not a guest, he was not a partner, he was not someone seeking approval or inclusion. He was the name on the documents, the one tied to the foundation that had quietly funded half the estate's recent renovations, the one whose decisions shaped things long before invitations were sent out. And yet he had never made himself visible in spaces like this, preferring distance over display. And now here he was, standing within a moment that had not been designed for him. And the effect was immediate, not loud but undeniable, as the balance that had already begun to shift tilted further, revealing something that had been hidden beneath assumptions. And Victoria's composure held, but only just, her expression tightening in a way that suggested calculation rather than certainty. Because this was not a situation she could resolve with a single gesture or a controlled tone. This was something larger, something connected to decisions made outside her control. And Ava, still beside the boy whose breathing had finally steadied, lifted her gaze not in surprise, but in recognition, subtle and quiet, the kind that came from understanding rather than shock. Because Daniel's presence did not introduce something new to her. It revealed something to everyone else. And when he stepped closer, the distance between them closing with quiet intention, he did not address the crowd, did not explain himself. He simply looked at Ava and gave a small nod, respectful, acknowledging. And in that single motion the final piece of the moment settled into place, not through declaration but through implication, because power, real power, did not need to announce itself. It only needed to be seen clearly once, and everything else followed. No one spoke right away because the meaning of what had just been revealed needed time to settle, not just in the mind but in the space itself, as if the entire garden had to quietly rearrange its understanding of who stood where. And Victoria Caldwell felt it before she could fully process it, the subtle shift in attention that no longer anchored itself to her, but moved elsewhere, not dramatically, not disrespectfully, but undeniably. And for the first time that evening her control did not feel absolute. It felt conditional, dependent on something she had not fully accounted for. And when she finally turned her gaze toward Daniel Reeves, her voice remained composed but carried a different weight now, one shaped by caution rather than certainty, asking for clarification without admitting the need for it. And Daniel did not rush to answer, did not fill the silence with explanation. Instead, he let the moment breathe, let the realization continue to unfold on its own terms before he spoke. And when he did, his words were simple, precise, offered without performance or embellishment. He explained that the estate, the land beneath their feet, the structure that housed every carefully curated detail of the evening, had never been transferred in full, that its ownership had remained under a trust long before Victoria's involvement, and that the trust itself was not managed by him in the way people assumed, but protected under a name that had not been mentioned once that night. Ava Brooks, and the effect of hearing it spoken aloud was immediate. Not loud, but deeply felt, like a current moving through the room, because it did not just reveal a fact, it redefined everything that had come before it, every assumption, every interaction, every silent hierarchy that had shaped the evening until now. And Ava did not step forward when her name was spoken, did not claim the moment or draw attention to herself. She remained exactly where she had been, beside the boy whose small hand now rested loosely in hers, his breathing calm, his gaze steady, as if the storm that had once threatened to overwhelm him had passed completely. And that contrast between the magnitude of what had been revealed and the quiet steadiness with which she held herself carried more impact than any declaration could have, because it showed that what defined her had never been hidden. It had simply been unseen, and Victoria stood there absorbing it all. The precision she had relied on now turning inward as she recalculated, not just the situation but her place within it. The certainty that had guided her actions now replaced with something more fragile, something that required acknowledgement rather than control. And for a moment, she said nothing. The silence no longer empty but full, heavy with understanding, until finally her posture shifted, not dramatically, not in surrender, but in recognition, her shoulders lowering just slightly, her gaze moving from Daniel back to Ava. And when she spoke again, her tone had changed, the sharp edge softened, replaced by something quieter, more measured, as if she were speaking not to correct but to reconcile. And though the words themselves were simple, the shift behind them was unmistakable, because for the first time that night, the balance of power was not being enforced, it was being accepted. The night did not end with applause or raised voices or any grand declaration. It settled instead into something quieter, something more honest, as the music resumed softly in the background and conversations returned in cautious fragments. But nothing felt quite the same as it had before, because once something true is seen clearly, it does not disappear, it reshapes the space around it. And Ava Brooks remained where she was for a moment longer, her hand still loosely holding the boy's, feeling the steadiness in his breathing, the calm that had returned not because the world around him had changed, but because someone had chosen to meet him where he was. And when she finally stood, it was not with urgency or hesitation. It was with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through the entire evening, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if the weight of what had just been revealed did not need to be carried outwardly to exist. And Daniel Reeves stepped back without ceremony, his role in the moment complete. His presence no longer needed to define what had already been understood, leaving the space open for something else to take its place. And across from them, Victoria Caldwell stood still, the structure she had relied on now rearranged into something she had not expected but could no longer deny. And though she did not speak again, the absence of resistance in her stance said enough. A quiet acknowledgement that control was not the same as understanding, that authority did not grant clarity, and that the person she had dismissed so easily was not defined by the role she had assigned her. And as Ava turned slightly, guiding the boy with her toward the wide glass doors that led back into the house, he followed without hesitation, his small steps matching hers, his hand tightening just enough to show trust rather than fear. And the light from inside spilled outward, softer than the garden lights, warmer, less performative, reflecting gently across the polished floor just beyond the threshold. And for a brief moment Ava paused at the doorway, not to look back for validation or recognition, but simply to take in the stillness that had settled behind her, the kind of stillness that carried meaning without needing words. And then she stepped forward, crossing into the space that had always been hers whether anyone had seen it or not, and the door closed quietly behind them, leaving the night outside to adjust, to absorb, to remember, as the echo of what had happened lingered not in sound but in understanding, and in that understanding, something lasting remained, not loud, not dramatic, but certain, like a light that did not need to shine brightly to be seen, only clearly enough to never be mistaken again.